Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that unless you're living in some alternate universe and just come out on Sunday mornings for worship, that life can be and often is hard. And that's because we do live in a sin-stained world that's filled with all kinds of challenges and difficulties and burdens. And sometimes it can really seem so overwhelming. Thankfully, though, as Christians, God has designed this community, this family, where we can bear one another's burdens, to help each other lift the load, if you will. And so it's with that in mind that we're going to take a look at a passage in the book of Galatians today. That's going to be our main text. Galatians chapter 6 and verses 1 through 5. Galatians 6, 1 through 5. There Paul writes, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For each one should bear his own load." Now, there are two main things that we want to get from our text today, so we'll have plenty of time to enjoy our baked potatoes. So, the first one is that we are to bear one another's burdens. Pretty simple. Back in our text there in verse 1, Paul tells the church that it's their responsibility to help out their fellow believers who are stuck in a sin. Think about it. Rather than ignoring someone who's caught in a sin, a mature Christian will go try to help them out. Now, the kind of sin that Paul is talking about is not a willful, defiant, persistent sin. It's an accidental sin. In other words, it's an isolated incident. And we could get that understanding from the Greek word that's translated as trespass. And that's because the word peripatoma means a falling to the side, like when someone's foot slips from a path and you sprain your ankle. It's a trespass. You've gone into forbidden territory. It says keep off the lawn, and you slipped and you got in there accidentally, okay? And so when the person is overtaken in any trespass, then those of us, a part of the family of God, his or her brothers and sisters in Christ who are spiritual, come alongside. By the way, that's that wonderful word parakletos again, this idea of being alongside someone, the sinning brother or sister, to help to restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Now, those who are spiritual in the church, well, Paul talked about in the previous chapter in Galatians chapter 5, right? Those are the ones who have put aside the envious, competitive nature of the flesh and have instead led the way in developing the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In other words, those who are spiritual don't have as their goal to punish or purge or retaliate. Their goal is to restore the erring sheep, the erring brother or sister in Christ, and return them to the fold, to the family of God. Now, the Greek word for restore in verse 1 is charizo. And charizo can mean to mend nets, like over in Matthew chapter 4, verse 21, or to teach disciples, like over in Luke chapter 4 and verse 40. Or to equip for service, like Ephesians 4:12, or even to furnish what is lacking, like over in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 21. And all those should be in your sermon notes in the back. The idea is to take something that's broken or incomplete or maybe even a little defective and to put it back into working condition. And when that's done with people, well, people are people, right? It's to be done gently, not with a sledgehammer, or some chisel, but gently. All right. That's why God tells us that those who are to do this, to charizo, a sinner, they're to be gentle. Then in verse 2, God tells us that we're to bear one another's burdens. In other words, helping another believer to overcome a burden of a certain sinful behavior. And that's one way that, we help someone to bear their burden. We're also told that the bearing of burdens can be reciprocal. In other words, those who are weak and those who are strong sometimes switch places. You're not always strong and you're not always weak. We're to bear one another's burdens. That all said, helping someone to overcome the burden of their sin is not the only way that we could carry another's burdens. And that's because the burdens that we can help to carry can include all kinds of difficulties that people face. Speaking practically, right? Because we're talking about this heavy weight that's placed upon your shoulders that's weighing you down. And we know when we're going through that, we kind of feel that. You don't want to move, you don't want to do anything, you just feel this weight upon you. And that might be something spiritual, might be something physical, might be something emotional or something else. Whatever it is, if it's a thing that's heavy to carry alone, then it's a burden, right? And God says those who are spiritual should help to bear that burden whenever we can. Now, you might have noticed something in our text from Galatians chapter 6. There's a lot of things you could have noticed, but there appears to be a contradiction back in verse 2. There we're told to bear one another's burdens. And then the last verse that we read in verse 6 said, for each one should bear his own load. Wait, what? That's like, what do you mean? So which one is it? Should we bear one another's burdens or not? Well, back in verse 2, again, the word translated burden means something that's heavy and crushing and a lot more than one could possibly carry without help. And in verse 6, verse 5, there we go. In verse 5, the word translated as load, sorry, give me a second here. Dry weather. Of course, it's dry all the time, right? Anyway, the word in verse 5, the word that's translated load, or sometimes burden in other translations, helping to add to the confusion a bit, is a word that's used to talk about a pack that was usually carried by a marching soldier. Paul often uses these words in his letters to get things across because of context, right? Well, anyway, that load, though, that the soldier is to carry, that's their purpose or their responsibility. It's the load that's given to them by their commanding officer. And that burden or load in verse 5 then is the one that we receive from our commander-in-chief, Jesus. has lifted our burdens, lifted them at Calvary. And remember again, too, that God calls upon you and me to help to bear the burdens of those around us. So at this time, if there's anyone subject to the invitation, I want to encourage you to come forward as we all stand and sing the song of